Donald Trump was passionately defending his immigration policy when, out of nowhere, he shifted focus to the UK and said, "Deport the Royal Guard." Laughter erupted across the room except from one man. A Royal Guard, sitting silently in full uniform, stood up. When he finally spoke, he asked just one question: if we're deporting those who stand still to honor sacrifice, should we start at Arlington? The room fell completely silent. Trump's grin disappeared, and for the first time that day, he had no response. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Let's get into it. The morning of September 15, 2025, dawned gray and cold over Washington, D.C., the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the tension already brewing beneath the surface of the Global Security Summit. World leaders had gathered at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center, their motorcades creating a symphony of sirens and security protocols that echoed through the capital's streets. Among them stood figures who would shape the course of history that day, though none of them knew it yet. Donald Trump arrived characteristically late, his signature red tie catching the flash of cameras as he stepped from his armored limousine. The former president, now back in office after his 2024 victory, carried himself with the familiar swagger that had defined his political career. His entourage followed behind like a well-rehearsed dance, advisors whispering last-minute briefings into his ear as they navigated the maze of security checkpoints. But it wasn't the American delegation that caught the attention of early arrivals. Standing at attention near the main entrance were 6 members of the British Royal Guard, their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats creating a striking visual against the modern glass and steel of the convention center. They had been specially assigned to represent the Crown's commitment to international security cooperation, a gesture that the British Prime Minister hoped would strengthen the special relationship between the two nations. Among these guards stood Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart, 28 years old, with shoulders that had carried more weight than most men twice his age. His service record was impeccable: 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless ceremonial duties that had earned him the respect of his peers and the admiration of tourists at Buckingham Palace. What the dignitaries filing past him didn't know was the small, sealed envelope tucked inside his uniform jacket, a document that had been personally signed by his commanding officer just 3 days prior. The envelope contained something unprecedented. In Royal Guard protocol, written authorization to break the sacred silence of ceremonial duty if the honor of the regiment was ever publicly insulted on the world stage. It was a precaution born from years of increasingly volatile international rhetoric, a recognition that sometimes the most powerful statement comes not from silence, but from speaking truth to power. As the morning sessions progressed, Hart remained motionless at his post, his trained eyes scanning the crowd while his mind wandered to memories that still haunted his quiet moments. 3 years ago, he had stood in this same position at another state function when his phone buzzed with a message that changed everything. His younger brother, Private Marcus Hart, had been killed by an improvised explosive device outside Kabul. Marcus was just 19, barely old enough to legally drink, but old enough to die for his country in a desert thousands of miles from home. The funeral had been held at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 7, Plot 42. Hart remembered every detail: the way the morning mist clung to the white marble headstones, the precise folds of the Union Jack as it was lifted from his brother's coffin, the hollow sound of boots on the gravel path as the honor guard carried Marcus to his final resting place. He had stood at attention for 12 hours that day, not allowing himself to grieve until the last visitor had left and the gates had closed behind them. Now, as he watched the parade of world leaders and their entourages, Hart felt the familiar weight of duty pressing down on his shoulders. The Royal Guard existed as living symbols of tradition, honor, and sacrifice, silent sentinels who embodied centuries of military heritage. They were not meant to be political figures or public speakers. They were meant to stand, to endure, to represent something greater than themselves. The lunch break brought a temporary lull to the proceedings, but Hart and his fellow guards remained at their posts. It was during this quieter period that he first noticed the change in atmosphere. American delegates were clustering in small groups, their conversations punctuated by occasional laughter and gestures in the direction of the British contingent. Something was building, a current of tension that experienced soldiers learned to recognize long before civilians notice anything amiss. President Trump, emerged from the main conference hall with his characteristic confidence, surrounded by of advisors and security personnel. He paused near the entrance, his attention seemingly caught by the sight of the motionless guards. For a moment, Hart thought the president might simply walk past. But then Trump's expression shifted into the familiar smirk that had become his trademark on television screens around the world. What happened next would be replayed on news channels and social media platforms for months to come, dissected by political commentators and military historians alike. Trump approached the guards with the casual swagger of a man accustomed to being the center of attention, his voice carrying clearly across the marble foyer as he addressed his entourage. "Look at these guys," Trump said, his tone dripping with mock admiration, "standing there like statues. You know, maybe we should deport them too, huh? Make some room for real Americans." The comment drew immediate laughter from the American delegation, a chorus of sycophantic approval that echoed off the walls. But the British contingent remained stone-faced, their diplomatic training preventing any visible reaction to what was clearly intended as a provocation. The joke was classic Trump, divisive, attention-grabbing, and delivered with the timing of a seasoned showman who understood exactly how to work a crowd. Hart felt something shift inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he learned of his brother's death. It was like ice water in his veins, a cold clarity that cut through years of training and protocol. His hand moved almost unconsciously to the sealed envelope in his jacket, his fingers tracing the edges of the document that could authorize him to break the most sacred rule of his profession. The laughter continued, growing louder as other delegates joined in, feeding off the president's apparent amusement. Trump basked in the attention, clearly enjoying the spotlight as cameras began to focus on the impromptu moment. This was exactly the kind of spontaneous, controversial comment that had defined his political career, the type of remark that would dominate news cycles and social media feeds. But as the laughter reached its peak, something extraordinary happened. Hart stepped forward, a movement so subtle that most observers initially didn't notice it. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached up and removed his bearskin hat, revealing his face to the assembled crowd for the first time since taking his post that morning. The symbolic weight of this action was immediately apparent to anyone familiar with Royal Guard protocol. The hat was never removed during ceremonial duties, never broken except in the most extraordinary circumstances. The room began to quiet as people noticed the unprecedented breach of protocol. Conversations died mid-sentence as delegates turned to stare at the young soldier who had just violated one of the most famous traditions in military ceremony. Hart's face was pale but determined, his jaw set with the kind of resolve that comes from making a decision that can never be undone. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp accent of his Yorkshire upbringing, each word pronounced with the precision of a man who had chosen them very carefully. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of the world's most powerful people suddenly focused on this single soldier who had dared to break his silence. "Mr. President," Hart said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made seasoned military officers in the crowd straighten unconsciously. "Shall we start the deportations at Arlington?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Trump's smile faltered, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion as he processed what had just been said. Around the room, the silence deepened as people began to understand the implications of Hart's words. Arlington National Cemetery, America's most sacred burial ground, where over 400,000 service members from every American war lay beneath white marble headstones. Hart continued, his voice never rising, but somehow filling every corner of the vast space. "My brother's name is on Section 7, Plot 42. Private Marcus Hart, aged 19. Killed by an improvised explosive device while serving alongside American forces in Afghanistan. Would you like his coffin dug up first, sir?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Several people in the crowd audibly gasped, the sharp intake of breath creating a sound like wind through cemetery trees. A British diplomat's pen clattered to the marble floor, the small sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. Trump's advisors exchanged panicked glances, their political instincts screaming that this moment was spinning rapidly out of control. But Hart wasn't finished. 3 years of grief, of standing silent while politicians played games with the lives of soldiers, of watching his brother's memory reduced to a statistic in foreign policy debates, had finally found their voice. He was buried with full honors, Mr. President, the same honors afforded to every American service member who makes the ultimate sacrifice. Perhaps you could explain to his headstone why his service wasn't quite American enough. The transformation in the room was palpable, like watching a tide turn in real time. What had begun as a moment of political theater had become something far more serious, far more profound. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in his public life, the man known for his quick comebacks and devastating one-liners found himself completely speechless. The cameras that had been focused on capturing another Trump controversy were now recording something entirely different. The most powerful man in the world being held accountable by a single soldier armed with nothing more than truth and moral authority. The image would become iconic within hours, analyzed by body language experts and political commentators who would note the exact moment when Trump's confident posture crumbled into something approaching humility. Then something remarkable happened. From across the room, a figure in uniform began to rise. General Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking African-American woman in the U.S. Army, slowly stood from her seat at the American delegation table. Her movement was deliberate, purposeful, and unmistakably respectful as she brought her hand to her forehead in a crisp military salute directed at Hart. The salute was like a pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the room. One by one, other uniformed personnel began to stand. A French colonel who had served in Mali, a German brigadier general who had lost 3 soldiers in Syria, a Canadian major whose unit had worked alongside British forces in Iraq. Within moments, dozens of military officers from multiple nations were on their feet, their salutes creating a forest of raised hands in a room that had been designed for diplomatic discourse, not military tribute. The civilians in the room watched in stunned silence as this unprecedented display of international military solidarity unfolded before their eyes. Diplomats who had spent careers navigating the subtle currents of international relations found themselves witnessing something they had never seen before. Soldiers from different nations, different cultures, different languages, united in their recognition of a fundamental truth about duty, sacrifice, and respect. Trump remained seated, isolated in the center of this growing circle of military respect. His political instincts, usually so sharp in moments of conflict, seemed to have completely abandoned him. The man who had built a career on dominating every room he entered now found himself utterly diminished by the simple, moral authority of a young soldier speaking truth about his dead brother. Hart remained at attention throughout this extraordinary display, his training preventing him from acknowledging the salutes even as his eyes registered every raised hand in his peripheral vision. The weight of what he had done was beginning to settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had broken protocol, violated the sacred silence of the Royal Guard, and transformed an international diplomatic summit into a moment of military remembrance. But as he stood there, feeling the solidarity of his fellow service members washing over him like a tide, Hart realized that some protocols were meant to be broken. Some silences were meant to be shattered. Some truths were more important than traditions, no matter how ancient or revered those traditions might be. The moment stretched on, for what felt like hours but was actually less than 3 minutes. Finally, General Williams broke the tableau by slowly lowering her salute and addressing the room in a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades of military service. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "perhaps we should take a brief recess to reflect on why we're all here today." Her eyes found Trump's, and for a moment, the 2 most powerful Americans in the room engaged in a silent conversation that needed no words. The spell was broken, but the damage was done. As delegates began to file out for the impromptu recess, conversations erupted in hushed, urgent tones. Phones appeared as if by magic, fingers flying over screens as news of the confrontation began to spread beyond the walls of the convention center. Social media would explode within the hour, but for now, the story belonged to the people who had witnessed it firsthand. Hart carefully replaced his bearskin hat and resumed his position at attention, but everything had changed. The tourists and delegates who passed him now did so with a different kind of awareness, a recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had just made history. Children pointed and whispered to their parents, while veterans in the crowd offered subtle nods of respect as they walked past. The afternoon sessions resumed with a subdued energy that was markedly different from the morning's proceedings. Trump returned to the conference hall, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished, his characteristic bravado replaced by an uncharacteristic quietness that his advisors found deeply troubling. The viral moment was already spreading across social media platforms, with hastily recorded cell phone videos beginning to accumulate millions of views. Hart's commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, arrived at the convention center within 2 hours of receiving word about the incident. Morrison was a career military man who had spent 30 years navigating the delicate balance between military tradition and political reality, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. As he approached Hart's position, he carried with him the weight of potential consequences that could end a promising military career. "Lance Sergeant Hart," Morrison said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the continuing summit. "I need to speak with you privately." For the first time since morning, Hart broke his ceremonial stance, following his commanding officer to a secure room that had been hastily arranged by British diplomatic security. The conversation that followed would remain classified for years to come, but witnesses reported seeing Morrison emerge from the room 30 minutes later with an expression that mixed pride, concern, and something that looked remarkably like admiration. Meanwhile, the story was exploding across global news networks. CNN, BBC, Fox News, and dozens of other outlets were running continuous coverage of what commentators were already calling the Arlington moment. Political analysts struggled to contextualize what they had witnessed. Was it an unprecedented breach of military protocol, a moment of justified moral courage, or something else entirely? The hashtags #ArlingtonMoment and #RespectTheGuard began trending worldwide within 3 hours of the confrontation. Veterans organizations issued statements of support, while political commentators debated the implications of a foreign soldier publicly challenging an American president on American soil. The complexity of the situation defied easy categorization, which only fueled more intense discussion and analysis. As evening approached, Hart found himself in the unusual position of having become an international figure while still technically being on ceremonial duty. The British Embassy had been flooded with media requests for interviews, statements, and background information, but Hart remained bound by military protocol that prohibited him from speaking to the press without official authorization. The political ramifications were already becoming apparent. Trump's social media accounts remained uncharacteristically quiet, his usual stream of immediate responses to any perceived slight conspicuously absent. His advisors were reportedly engaged in intense damage control, trying to craft a response that could somehow salvage the situation without appearing weak or insensitive to military sacrifice. Meanwhile, veterans groups across America began organizing spontaneous gatherings at Arlington National Cemetery. What started as a few dozen people leaving flowers at Section 7, Plot 42, grew throughout the day into hundreds of visitors paying their respects to Private Marcus Hart and, by extension, to his brother, who had spoken truth to power. The cemetery administration, accustomed to managing official ceremonies and tourist visits, found themselves dealing with an unprecedented outpouring of public support. Hart's fellow royal guards maintained their positions throughout these developments, their training allowing them to remain focused on their duties even as the world around them erupted into chaos. But anyone who looked closely could see the subtle signs of solidarity, a slightly straighter posture, a more intense focus, small gestures that communicated their support for their colleagues' actions without breaking their own ceremonial obligations. The British government found itself in a delicate position, caught between supporting one of their soldiers and maintaining diplomatic relations with their most important ally. Emergency meetings were convened in London, with senior officials debating how to respond to a situation that had no precedent in modern diplomatic history. The special relationship between Britain and America was being tested in ways that no one had anticipated when the summit was originally planned. As the summit's official proceedings drew to a close, the aftershocks of Hart's confrontation continued to reverberate through political and military circles around the world. News analysis programs devoted entire segments to examining the implications of what had transpired, with retired generals, political scientists, and international relations experts offering their perspectives on a moment that seemed to defy conventional categorization. The story had transcended its origins as a diplomatic incident and evolved into something much larger, a conversation about respect, sacrifice, and the relationship between military service and political power. Op-ed writers struggled to capture the significance of a moment when a single soldier had managed to silence the most powerful person on earth, with nothing more than a reference to his brother's grave. Hart's personal story began to emerge through careful reporting by journalists who spoke with his former colleagues, military records, and residents of his Yorkshire hometown. The picture that emerged was of a young man who had joined the military not out of economic necessity or lack of options, but from a genuine sense of duty and family tradition. His father had served in the Falklands, his grandfather in World War II, creating a legacy of service that gave additional weight to his unprecedented actions. The international military community's response was perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire affair. Soldiers from dozens of countries took to social media to share their own stories of loss, sacrifice, and the sometimes painful gap between political rhetoric and military reality. What had begun as one man's moment of moral courage had sparked a global conversation about the true cost of war and the respect owed to those who pay that cost. Trump's eventual response, when it finally came, was notably subdued by his usual standards. A carefully worded statement acknowledged the sacrifice of all service members, while stopping short of apologizing for his initial comments. Political observers noted the unusual restraint in his language, interpreting it as evidence that even he recognized the moral authority that Hart had wielded in their confrontation. 3 days after the summit concluded, Hart was quietly reassigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace, officially described as a routine rotation, but understood by everyone involved as a way to remove him from the intense media spotlight, while the political ramifications of his actions continued to unfold. His return to London was met by crowds of supporters who had gathered to show their appreciation for his courage. But Hart himself remained bound by military protocol that prevented him from making public statements. The long-term consequences of the Arlington moment would continue to ripple through international relations for months to come. Diplomatic historians would later mark it as a turning point in the relationship between military service and political discourse, a moment when traditional boundaries were challenged and redefined by moral necessity. For Hart personally, the aftermath brought both recognition and burden. He received private letters of support from military families around the world, but he also carried the weight of knowing that his 3 minutes of speech had forever changed his relationship with the institution he had sworn to serve. The Royal Guard would never be quite the same, and neither would the young soldier who had chosen truth over tradition when history demanded a response. Years later, when military historians and political scientists analyzed the global security summit of 2025, they would focus on those crucial moments when Lance Sergeant Tobias Hart stepped forward and spoke for his fallen brother. In doing so, he had reminded the world that behind every uniform, every ceremony, every tradition, there were real people who had made real sacrifices. Some stories, he had demonstrated, are too important for silence. The Grove at Arlington National Cemetery continues to receive visitors who come specifically to pay their respects at Section 7, Plot 42, where Private Marcus Hart rests beneath a simple white marble headstone. They come to honor not just one fallen soldier, but the brother who refused to let his memory be diminished by political theater. In the end, perhaps that was the most fitting tribute of all, ensuring that sacrifice is remembered with the dignity it deserves, regardless of the political cost of speaking that truth.